about a few days before the summit between the presidents of China and the United States, the Chinese embassy here in Washington made a post on X. It's this post right here. As you can see, it was quite bold and quite frank about what it called red lines. And of course, these are the issues that China said before we even meet. Here is what we're not willing to kind of budge on or move on or just or get into even. So this was quite instructive. And when I saw this, I knew I had to make a post about this summit and what it says to the African foreign policy makers, African foreign policy practitioners, or anyone who's dealing with East Asia and the United States from an African vantage point. Why? Because when presidents of such countries meet, there's bound to be something that can be gleaned. The first thing I can think of, CSS, constructive strategic stability. The president of China, in his speech, mentioned that there should be 4 stabilities between China and the US. Positive stability, where it's kind of everyone is working toward making stability their thing to pursue between these two countries. Healthy stability, making sure that there are parameters for their stability, and constant stability and lasting stability, making sure that this is stability that's going to basically sustain itself. Of course, China is quite good at coming up with these big doctrines, and they usually come out of crises. I remember in 1954, China and India were had a pretty hard time, and out of that emerged the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence that became kind of a doctrine for Chinese foreign policy. Some might say till this very day, the respect for each other's territorial integrity, mutual non-aggression, mutual benefit, non-interference in each other's affairs, and peaceful coexistence. So it is in that spirit, this long view, then one might take this constructive strategic stability doctrine that has emerged out of Beijing. The G2, some of you may laugh, but it's bubbling up to the surface. In fact, the very presence of and the hard work that the president of France, Macron, was doing in Africa, one might argue it was actually a countervailing approach to this G2 emerging thing that basically says that there are now 2 superpowers in the world, and US and China. But it's a movie Africans have seen before, for better or for worse. During the Cold War, many African leaders were left with no choice but to choose. So if you were seen talking to one side, you were sometimes automatically an enemy of the other. So, but these times are different. So there could be mutual alignment, so to speak. In other words, when you're aligned with both, you are aligned kind of neither. So that's up to each African country, I would say. I wouldn't be so enthusiastic about this big African nebulous policy. I don't think that's practical. So each African country must then ask itself, what does mutual non-alignment mean? That this G business has often been fraught with a lot of politics. Like it started off as G7, then I think in 97, Russia gets kind of brought in and it became a G8. In 2000, thereabouts, someone came up with a bright idea that let us have a whole bunch of emerging economies being invited on the last day of the G8. And so China would attend Brazil, South Africa, sometimes Nigeria, India, of course. And then in 2000, a few countries like stopped. China stopped attending, India stopped attending, Brazil. The Great Recession had taken place. There was a lot of emphasis that was put on G20. In fact, G20 had never been so popular. In fact, many Africans had often derided the view of this idea that there is an elite club to which we're not invited. We come kind of like as the hired, photo. I think in 2011, incidentally, South Africa stopped attending as guess what? When it stopped attending, that whether you say it coincided or correlated, I'll leave you to decide on that. But it stopped attending right as it was about to join BRICS. So there you go. And then in 2014, after the annexation of Crimea, Russia was effectively excluded, and then G8 went back to G7. I think if for South Africa, after President Zuma left, Ramaphosa came in, South Africa went back to being kind of one of the invited guests of G7. South Africa still attends the G7. But then, as fate would have it, South Africa was not, invited to this year's G7. So there's a lot of politics there's a lot of boundary set, like flexing that takes place as well. There's a cynical way of viewing this G2 business. There's also kind of a realpolitik way that, well, the current world is effectively a G2. Of course, there's a lot of debate on that, but that's the context.